Hello, I'm David Gibson, Director of the Center on Religion and Culture at Fordham University in New York, and I want to welcome you all to our webinar, Black Churches, Black Catholics. This webinar is part of an ongoing series on race and faith that we are presenting in collaboration with our colleagues here at Fordham, the Office on Campus Ministry. The framing of our conversation today is a landmark new study from the Pew Research Center, Faith Among Black Americans. This historic survey was published during February's Black History Month, a time when we put a special focus on issues on race and the Black American experience, and in particular on race and religion, which are so closely connected. Exhibit A, there's the wonderful Henry Louis Gates series on PBS these days, The Black Church. But Black believers have always played an outsized role in the nation's religious as well as political and social life, that despite America's brutal legacy of systemic racism. That role has really come into especially sharp relief over the past year with the spate of police killings and brutalizations of Black Americans that have only now come to the public consciousness. And also the role of the Black churches in particular in the response to America's recent political upheavals. I think it's fair to say that without the support of Black voters and churches, Joe Biden might not have won the Democratic nomination and the subsequent general election. And Democrats would not have won control of the Senate without the victory in Georgia of a Black pastor, the Reverend Raphael Warnock. Not to mention the organizing genius of Stacey Abrams, who herself was raised and formed by a United Methodist family and church in Georgia. So what does the landscape of the faith of Black Americans look like today? Is it diversifying? How does the congregational life of Black Christians compare to other believers? And how does it affect their lives and politics, and thus our society? And as we are a Jesuit and Catholic university here at Fordham, we also want to ask, what's the size and nature of the Black Catholic community? It's a community you don't often hear about, even within the Catholic Church itself. But we'll find out much more about that in just a moment. Now, to walk us through these findings, we're grateful to have with us the principal researchers on the Pew Report, Dr. Bashir Muhammad and Dr. Kiana Cox. Dr. Muhammad is a senior researcher at the Pew Research Center. He received his doctorate in sociology and master's degree in Middle East studies from the University of Chicago. Dr. Kiana Cox is a research associate at the Pew Research Center, where she works on the center's domestic polling about religion. She contributes to the center's work on race and religion with particular attention to African American communities, and she earned her doctorate in sociology from the University of Illinois at Chicago. We're also joined by Dr. Tia Noel Pratt, a sociologist of religion specializing in the ways that systemic racism affects Black Catholic identity. Dr. Pratt received her doctorate in sociology from our own Fordham University in 2010. She is the president of T.N. Pratt and Associates, an inclusion and diversity consulting firm in Philadelphia, and she is the curator of the Black Catholics Syllabus. She is currently working on a book, Faithful and Devoted, Racism and Identity in the African American Catholic Experience. Dr. Pratt, I should note, was also a consultant on this Pew survey from its inception. And last but not least, Father Brian Massengale, a priest of the Archdiocese of Milwaukee and a colleague, a professor of theological and social ethics here at Fordham, and the James and Nancy Buckman Chair in Applied Christian Ethics. Father Massengale's most recent book is Racial Justice and the Catholic Church. His current writing projects explore the contributions of Black radicalism to Catholic theology and the intersections of race, sexuality, and faith. Now, here's how our program will go. Dr. Muhammad and then Dr. Cox will take us through an overview of the Pew report for about 20 minutes, while Dr. Pratt and Father Massengale and I cycle off the screen. Then we'll come back on screen, and Dr. Pratt and Father Massengale will offer a few of their thoughts about the findings, and then we'll all engage in a conversation about what we have heard and learned. That conversation will also include questions and suggestions from you, our online audience. A reminder, more than 300 of you have signed up, which is great, but please use the chat function at the bottom of the screen to post questions. I will sift through them and pose them to our panelists throughout the discussion. Now I'll turn the screen over to Dr. Bashir Muhammad and Dr. Kiana Cox. Friends.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be here talking about this new project that we've done. The Pew Research Center has done this dedicated effort to explore the religious lives of Black Americans. And that's the backbone of both this presentation and the accompanying report. A dedicated effort like this is important because it allows us to do at least two things that we aren't otherwise able to do. First, it allows us to ask questions which are most relevant to Black American religious lives and experiences. For example, the role of Black churches. There's been a distinctive historical and contemporary role of Black churches in the lives of Black Americans. And so that's a topic that we were able to explore along with a variety of others. The second is it allows us to draw large enough samples in the survey portion of this study to unpack the diversity of Black American religious lives. So to talk about the religious experiences of Black Catholics, to talk about religiously unaffiliated Black Americans, to talk about African immigrants, all of them have distinctive religious experiences, and their stories are often lost in broader narratives of the religious lives of Black Americans, broadly speaking. So I'm going to start by just giving a brief overview of some of the key findings of our study, and then Dr. Cox will pick it up and talk specifically about some of our findings as it relates to Black Catholics and how they compare to Black Protestants. Before I do that, I do want to take a minute to talk a little bit about the Pew Research Center, the organization that I work for and that conducted this study. The Pew Research Center is a nonpartisan, non-advocacy fact tank. So what that means is that we don't take positions on matters of policy, on matters of politics, or even on matters of religion, whether religion is good or bad, whether we want it to be growing or shrinking. These aren't topics that we have a position on. What we do have as a position is that facts matter, and that knowing the facts of a situation, knowing whether or not it's growing or shrinking, knowing how many Black Americans identify as religious or non-religious, as Catholic, as Protestant, as religiously unaffiliated, is going to be important for people who are interested in those questions, whether they're interested in seeing more Black Catholics or fewer Black Catholics, more Black Protestants, fewer Black Protestants. Knowing where the community is now is going to be important in understanding those questions. So that's the position that generally the Pew Research Center takes. Talking specifically about the question of how many Black Protestants, Black Catholics there are, one of the things that we see is that the majority of Black Americans do identify as Protestant. A smaller share, only about 6%, identify as Catholic. So that's significantly smaller than the share of Americans in the larger US public who identify as Catholic. And Black Americans are also somewhat less likely than Americans overall to be religiously unaffiliated. That is, to identify as atheist or agnostic or say that they have no particular religion. Looking specifically at the data that we saw on religiously unaffiliated Black Americans, we see an interesting distinction. Black Americans who say that they have no particular religion are actually quite religiously engaged by a variety of measures. Most of them, 9 in 10 or more, say that they believe in God or some other higher power, although that's usually not the God of the Bible, it's some other higher power or spiritual force. More than half say that they pray at least a few times a month, and about 4 in 10 say that they believe that prayers to ancestors in particular can protect them from harm. And about 1 in 5 actually say that they attend religious services at least a few times a year. Now that's those people who say that they have no particular religion. Now, Black Americans who identify as atheist or agnostic are significantly less religious by all of these measures. They're much less likely to say they believe in any sort of higher power. They're much less likely to say that they pray, and much less likely to attend religious services. So we see this interesting distinction between Black Americans who identify as atheist and agnostic and those who say they have no particular religion, whereas those who say they have no particular religion are often relatively religious by a variety of measures. In fact, Black Americans writ large are relatively religious by a variety of measures. One common measure of religiosity that gets used in surveys is attendance at religious services. And we see about 2/3 of Black Americans say they attend religious services at least a few times a year, including about 1/3 that say that they attend religious services at least once a week. Now, at this point, it's probably worth me taking a minute to talk about the timing of the survey. This survey was conducted about this time last year, so before the coronavirus pandemic forced congregations to close down and people to change their religious service attendance. We've done some additional polling on how people have adapted broadly and how Black Americans specifically have adapted to the virus, and perhaps we can talk about that some in the Q&A. But this survey offers a baseline that we can look at in terms of what we were seeing in terms of levels of engagement before the pandemic. Now, broadly speaking, we see that Black Americans are likely to attend religious services, but we see a significant difference by age group. About half of Black Americans in the oldest cohort say they attend religious services at least every week, whereas only about a quarter, 23% in that cohort say they seldom or never attend religious services. And if we sort of look down to the youngest cohort, Generation Z, we see the pattern is almost reversed, whereas nearly half say that they seldom or never attend religious services, and about a quarter say they attend religious services at least weekly. So we definitely see a pattern where older Black Americans are much more religiously engaged than younger Black Americans. Although it's worth noting that the younger Black Americans, while certainly less religious than their elders, are still more religious than their peers of other races. Continuing to talk about attendance of religious services, we see that African immigrants, another group that often isn't highlighted in discussions of the religious lives of Black Americans, are somewhat more religious than US-born Blacks. That's true about attendance in religious services. That's true about self-reported importance of religion. That's true by a variety of measures. Now, one thing that's not true, they're only about as likely as other Black Americans, as US-born Blacks, to say that prayers to ancestors can protect them from harm. I highlight that because it's sometimes assumed that prayers to ancestors are a African practice, and so it would be uniquely common among African immigrants, and that's not what we see. We see it equally common among African immigrants and among US-born Blacks. African immigrants are also somewhat more conservative by some measures. They're somewhat less likely to say that homosexuality should be accepted by society, for example. They're somewhat less likely to say in a two-parent household where there's both a mother and a father, the mother and father should share financial responsibility equally. So they're both more religious and also more socially conservative by some measures. Now, more generally, we see that Black Americans who attend religious services at all, regardless of their age or their country of birth, the majority say that they attend religious services in a congregation where most of the, a congregation where most of the other congregants identify as Black and where their leadership is Black. Only about 13% of Black Americans say they attend religious services at a congregation where whites or some other group make up the majority in the leadership. And about 1 in 5 Black Americans who attend religious services say they do so at a congregation where there's no one clear majority. So this is significant, I think, because as I've seen in a number of conversations, many people don't recognize or realize the significance of Black congregations. Now, one way to look at it is this way, to see just how common they are. And they are the most common type of congregation for church-going Blacks. Another way to think about it is to think about the ways in which these congregations are distinctive. They're distinctive in terms of the styles of worship that you see there. They're distinctive in terms of the content of the sermons that people hear there. They're also distinctive in terms of the history of the historical role that they've played. Building on that in particular, we can say that most Black Americans, about 3/4, say that they feel that predominantly Black churches played an important role in helping Blacks move toward equality in the US. So this historical role that Black churches in particular have played is one that's highlighted by many Black Americans. Now, it's worth noting a few things. One is that Black Muslim organizations, such as the Nation of Islam, are also credited as playing some role by about half of all Black Americans. And these patterns actually don't vary very much based on whether or not we're talking to someone who actually goes to a Black congregation or not. There's a general sense that Black churches played an important role in this way. Black Americans are much less likely, for example, to say that white congregations or white churches played an important role in helping Blacks move toward equality in this country. And the affinity, the role that Black churches play is not purely historical. You can look at data in terms of what people want Black congregations to do now, and we see that about 4 in 10 Black Americans say that churches, Black churches in particular, should have more influence in public discourse and public dialogue than they do now. And a similar share say that those churches, the Black churches, should have about the same level of influence in Black communities as they do now. And only a relatively small share of Black Americans say that Black churches should have less influence than they currently do in the religious lives of Black Americans. So these are some of the general patterns that we see in this data. We see that Black Americans often do go to Black congregations. We see that that's a significant pattern that draws upon both the historical role and also some contemporary expectations. We see significant differences in the general pattern we see among Black Americans. If we look at African immigrants, if we look at religiously unaffiliated Black Americans. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Kiana Cox, who can talk some more about the patterns that we see among Black Catholics and the way in which Black Catholics differ from Black Protestants. Over to you.
Thanks, Bashir. Now, I would like to turn to some of our findings on Black Catholics. Our data shows that nearly 1 in 5 Black Catholics attends Mass at predominantly Black churches. The majority of Black Catholics attend churches where the other parishioners are white or some other race. In comparison, the majority of Black Protestants attend churches where congregations are mostly Black. So, what this data is demonstrating to us is that nearly 1 in 5 Black Catholics attends predominantly Black Catholic churches. Aside from being more likely to attend a Black church, our data demonstrates that Black Protestants are also more likely than Black Catholics to say that religion is very important to them. About half of all Black Catholics say that religion is a significant factor in their personal lives, compared to about 70% of Black Protestants. This sentiment strengthens, though, when we look at those who attend church regularly. So, about 60% of Black Catholics who attend church at least a few times a year say that religion is very important to them. However, larger shares of Black Protestants say this, about 80%. And really quickly, I want to also build a little bit of context for this section of the presentation. Another unique factor of this survey and being able to present this data and to collect this data is that, unlike many surveys, we have been able to pull Black Catholics out and analyze them as their own sample. So that's how we're able to report on these particular findings here for you today. So we see that by some of our measures, Black Catholics are a little bit less religious than Black Protestants, in the sense that they are less likely, a little less likely, to say that religion is very important to them. However, if we turn to attendance in terms of religious services, so how often Black Catholics attend Mass, nearly 2/3 of Black Catholics say that they attend Mass at least once a year, if not more. This is compared to about 75% of Protestants who do so. So again, we have these two measures of religiosity, one in terms of frequency of attendance, and Catholics are slightly less likely than Protestants to go to church at least once a year, if not more. And Catholics are also a little less likely than Protestants to say that religion plays a significant role in their lives. If we continue on this question of church attendance and where people go, it's one of the things that we wanted to point out, and another, I think, unique feature of this survey, is that we're able to look at people based on their nativity or where they were born. So we see, if you pay attention to the light red bars in the center of the screen, although the majority of Black adults are Protestant, we see that about 20% of African immigrants and 15% of Caribbean immigrants attend Catholic Mass, as compared to only 5% of US born Black adults. So this means that African and Caribbean immigrants are more likely to attend Catholic churches than Black adults born in the United States. So these are some different pictures in terms of attendance when it comes to Black Catholics. A little less likely to attend than Protestants. But in terms of nativity, African and Caribbean born Black adults are more likely to attend Catholic churches than Black adults born in the United States. Now I'd like us to take a look at some other questions that we ask beyond these foundational measures of religiosity. So beyond attendance and beyond identification and where people go to church, we also wanted to look at questions of race, gender, and sexuality based on religious affiliation. And so we asked Black Americans what they considered to be essential factors in their faith, or in terms of what their faith means to them. And so we see here at the very top on the first line that belief in God is the most common response to this question. So 84% of Black Americans who are affiliated with a religion say that believing in God is an essential aspect of that religion. But also, and I mean, we might expect that, right? If you're affiliated with a religion, a belief in a higher power is something that we might predict would be there. But also among Black Americans, what we found is that opposing racism is pretty close in terms of essential of things that are essential to Black Americans' faith. Opposing racism is pretty close to believing in God in that regard. So belief in God is at, again, about 84%, but opposing racism is at about 75% for both Catholics and Protestants, in terms of that being something that's essential to what their faith means to them. Also, we see that opposing sexism is essential to faith. So Black Catholics and Protestants don't differ in this belief much at all. About 75% of both groups say that opposing sexism and opposing racism are essential parts of what their religion means to them. Now, I want you all to take a look just at sort of the contrast of the items that were asked about in this particular set of questions. Notice that believing in God and opposing racism and sexism outpace the share of all Black Americans, regardless of religious affiliation, in terms of those things being essential to their faith, more so than these other elements. So opposing racism, opposing sexism are more essential to Black Americans' faith than attending religious services, more essential than avoiding premarital sex, and more essential than opposing abortion. If we remain on questions of race, so we see that opposing racism is essential to the faith is essential to their faith for both Black Catholics and Protestants. This survey also demonstrates that the majority of both of these groups say that Blackness is somewhat or very important to how they think about themselves. So at least 8 in 10 Black Catholics and Protestants say this, along with large majorities of other faith groups and also the religiously unaffiliated. So we see so far that in terms of race, racial identity is important to Black Americans' sense of their faith, and it's also important to their sense of self. If we continue on this question of race, and this is a contrast that I'd like us to take a look at. So we see that nearly 3/4 of Black Americans say that opposing racism and sexism are essential to their faith. Over 80% say that being Black is an important part of how they think about themselves. But what's interesting is that a little less than half of that share actually hear sermons about race at their houses of worship. So we see that about 40% of Black adults who attend Catholic churches and nearly 50% of those who attend Black Protestant churches heard sermons about race in the year before they took the survey. So that's in 2019. Black adults who attend Protestant churches were also just about as likely to hear sermons on voting and political engagement as they were to hear sermons about race. So these are Black adults who attend Black Protestant churches, about equally as likely to hear sermons on race and voting. If we look at Black Catholics, they were a little bit less likely to hear sermons about voting or political engagement than they were to hear sermons about race. So that contrast is something that we wanted to point out, that race is important to how Black Americans think about their faith. It's important to how they think about themselves, but much smaller shares are actually hearing sermons about race relations or voting and political engagement in their houses of worship. And right here, in terms of our discussion of race, just to wrap this up a little bit in terms of talking about race, although Black identity is important in terms of faith and in terms of sense of self, race is actually not a priority for very many Black adults in terms of what they look for if they were looking for a new congregation. So we see that only about 10% of Black Catholics and 15% of Black Protestants say that having a Black congregation or a church with Black clergy would be an essential element of what they would be looking for if they were looking for new congregations. So again, we see that here, or at least in this case, looking for a Black congregation or a Black pastor or priest is not necessarily as essential to Black Americans when they're looking for a congregation. What's more essential for them, what they are more likely to look for, are a sense of feeling welcome, so feeling welcomed in the congregation, and they're also more likely to look for inspiring sermons. So about 80% of Black Americans, regardless of religious affiliation, say that they want, if they were looking for a church, they'd want that church to be welcoming. And if they were looking for a church, they'd want that church to have inspiring sermons. Those are the elements that they're more likely to look for, more so than to look for the race of the congregation or Black congregation or Black clergy. If we turn to questions of gender and sexuality, there are a few other differences that we'd like to highlight. So first, we see that Black Catholics are almost twice as likely as Black Protestants to say that their religious leaders should perform same-sex marriage, that their religious leaders should perform same-sex marriage ceremonies. Nearly 2/3 of Black Catholics say this, while only about 1/3 of Black Protestants do. More broadly, Black Catholics are more likely to say that same-sex relationships should be accepted in society writ large. About 80% of Black Catholics hold that view in terms of same-sex relationships being accepted in the broader society, compared to 60% of Black Protestants. So what our data demonstrates to us is that Catholics are more accepting of same-sex marriages being performed in their churches and more accepting of it in the wider society than Black Protestants are. However, when it comes to gender, those results are a little bit more mixed. Here we see that Black Protestants and Catholics are about equally as likely to say that they believe a woman should be able to serve as the senior leader of a congregation. Nearly 90% of both Black Catholics and Black Protestants hold that view. So they are in agreement in terms of whether or not a woman should be able to hold religious leadership. However, there are some differences, though, when we ask Black Americans about the kinds of gender norms that their congregations emphasize. So what are the kinds of things that your congregation emphasizes for men versus the kinds of things that your congregation emphasizes for women? Overall, we see that there is very little difference in terms of this gender norm expectation when it comes to parenting. So 71% of Black Americans say that men should be involved parents, and 69% say that women should be. So very little difference there. However, these differences broaden if we look at family financial support and being role models in Black communities. So Black Americans say that their congregations are more likely to emphasize that Black men should be primary breadwinners and that Black men should be role models in Black communities. They are more likely to emphasize that for Black men than they are for Black women. When it comes to religious affiliation, Black Catholics are less likely than Protestants to say they go to churches that emphasize any of these roles. So Black Catholics are less likely to say that their churches emphasize gender norms in terms of parenting, being involved in the congregation, being role models in Black communities, or supporting families financially. So Catholics are less likely to emphasize any of these, but there are still some differences. On the specific question of role models in Black communities, Black Catholics are about as likely to say that their parishes emphasize role modeling for both men and women. There's not this gender difference in terms of expectation. However, on the question of financial support, Black Catholics attend churches where it's emphasized that men be the primary breadwinners. It's emphasized more for men than for women. This suggests that, on one hand, Black Catholics attend churches that do not have gendered expectations for community role modeling, but do have gendered expectations for breadwinners and family financial support. Black Protestants, however, attend churches where there are gendered expectations for both of those elements, family financial support and role modeling in Black communities. So these are some of our findings in terms of things that our data demonstrates about Black Catholics. On some of our measures, they're less religious than Black Protestants. On some of our measures in terms of gender, Black Protestants and Catholics are similar in terms of wanting to see women in leadership. They differ a little bit in terms of the gendered expectations that they say their congregation has for families and communities, but also for Black Protestants and Catholics, we see that being Black is important to their personal sense of faith and their personal sense of self. I'm going to turn this back over to David in order to help facilitate our discussion, but I wanted to let you all know that if you want to read our report in full, for you to visit us at pewresearch.org/blackfaith. And there you'll be able to see these numbers in more detail and to read our chapters on gender, race, religious affiliation, and church attendance. David, I'll turn this back over to you.
Well, thanks so much, Dr. Kiana Cox. That's terrific, and Dr. Muhammad. It's great, so much fodder for so many questions that pop out at me. One quick one before I turn it to Brian Massengale and Tia Pratt. Dr. Muhammad, a couple of questions in the chat box on methodology. Can you just give us a quick summary about, how many were contacted, and how you contacted people, what the conversations you had?
Sure, absolutely. So, this project actually included a variety of components. Included a nationally representative survey, it included focus groups, it included in-depth interviews with clergy. The core of it was a nationally representative survey of Black Americans. And in this survey, we contacted and spoke to over 8,500 Black respondents. Now, to give context to some people who don't do a lot of work with surveys, that's actually larger than many studies of the entire public. So that's why we're able to look at religiously unaffiliated Black Americans, African immigrants, Black Catholics. We're able to look at these groups that only make up 4, 5, 6, 7% of Black Americans because the overall sample was so large. It's also important, though, not just to have a large sample, but to have a representative sample. And so how did we make sure that that sample was representative? So most of the study was done online, but it wasn't an online opt-in panel. It wasn't like you could just go to the website and say, well, I want to take a survey. We actually recruited people basically based on addresses. We randomly selected addresses is basically how it worked, without getting too in the weeds. And then we would send a letter to that address saying, please take this survey, basically. And the first request would be to ask them to go online to take the survey. Ultimately, we know that not everyone is comfortable going online, not everyone has internet access. And so for people who weren't comfortable going online, there were 2 other ways that they could complete the survey. Some of them had the option to complete it over the phone, and others had the option to complete it by mail. So they would get just a packet that they could fill out and send back in a sort of self-addressed stamp envelope. And so all of that was done in order to make sure not only is it a large sample, but it's a representative sample. And so we have confidence that we have a description of not just Black Americans writ large, but also these important subgroups.
Great, thanks, many thanks. As you said in your presentation, facts matter. And that can be a controversial statement today, but we're really thankful for that. So I want to flip it over to first Dr. Pratt, and just maybe take a couple of minutes and give us some of your reactions, thoughts about this really important survey.
Sure, thank you. So, as was said earlier, I was an advisor to the team at Pew on this project for more than 3 years. Even before the project officially began, I was invited to come to Pew and talk about some of my work. And as the team was beginning to think about what this survey would look like, and that was really important to me because as we heard and throughout the presentation, surveys of this style often aren't large enough to be able to analyze Black Catholics. And so to be able to bring my work to the Pew team, even before the project really started, meant that Black Catholics would be on the radar before the project formally began. And so because of this, large sample, as we heard just a minute ago in the discussion of the methodology, it meant that we now have, we're able to analyze Black Catholics in a way that we haven't before in surveys of this style. And we can have so much more confidence in, as researchers, especially qualitative researchers such as myself, in the numbers that we're including in our work about Black Catholics as we discuss a myriad of other issues. So this is really a game-changing study in terms of, how I will move forward in my work. I'm already thinking about how I can include this work in the book that I'm finishing up and projects that I have in mind down the road. So this is really a wonderful project, and I have just been so happy to have been a part of it.
Thank you, Dr. Pratt. Father Massengale, what strikes you from this survey as your long experience as a Black Catholic priest, one of the few, as we say, which I think is also a notable question that people had about the smaller numbers of Black clergy. We can get to that at some point. But what stands out to you?
Well, first, I want to just express an immense debt of gratitude to the Pew folks for including a sample that gives us the kind of detailed quantitative data that we need for effective pastoral planning in the Black Catholic community. For years, we've been saying that one of the things that hamstrings us in terms of pastoral planning is we don't have the data. We don't even know how many Black Catholics there are. And so even that kind of basic kind of information is so important. As I was looking at this survey, I mean, several things jumped out at me, but one that was not discussed in general, but one I do think is really important going forward is something I call the Black Catholic exodus that came up in the survey. That when you looked at the percentage of current Catholics who were raised Catholics, or people who are raised Catholics who are still Catholic, only 54% of adults who were raised Catholic, Black Catholic, still are Catholic today. And that is significant. It's a significant difference from Black Protestants. 81% who are raised Protestant are still Protestant. And even from the wider adult population, in terms of 61% of white Catholics who are raised Catholic are still Catholic. And so this exodus that Black Protestants don't tend to become Black Catholics, Black unaffiliated folks don't tend to become Black Catholics, but Black Catholics tend to leave the Catholic Church and become either unaffiliated or Protestant. This has really major implications going forward. That we know that the Catholic Church is hemorrhaging members in general, but the rate of exodus out of the Catholic Church from the Black Catholic community is even more noticeable, and even, I would say, even more severe. And so that was something that struck me as I was going through this. There are a number of things, but I think even to have that kind of data is so important for not only planning for our Black Catholic futures, but also in terms of what it says to the rest of the church about why this kind of, what accounts for this kind of difference. So I think it's an amazing study, and it's extremely important. So a debt of gratitude for Pew for including Black Catholics in the survey and giving us the kind of data that we need.
Dr. Cox and Dr. Muhammad, or I'd like to go to Father Brian and Tia Pratt on why that exodus might be. But a quick question, data-wise, do we know where they're going? Black Catholics in particular? You see a huge exodus of white Catholics. And from what I recall, a lot of them are, going to non-denominational places or no place at all, I think, which is a real problem and challenge. Do we know where Black Catholics in particular are going? Are they going to other, Black churches?
It's a pretty even split among Black Americans who are raised Catholic between those that are now identified religiously unaffiliated and those who are now could say they're Protestant. So they're about equally likely to completely disaffiliate and to become Protestant.
Father Brian, Tia, what, why, I could guess some of the answers, but why are Black Catholics leaving, do you think, at a higher rate than from church than Black Protestants are from their churches?
Do you want to start? You want me to?
I mean, I was studied the numbers, so I have some hypotheses, but you're a sociologist. Why don't you go first?
Okay. Well, I mean, first, how much time you got?
Really.
When I was at Rose Hill years ago, thinking about what my dissertation was going to be, the first topic I wanted to explore was this Exodus. And one of the professors I was working with said, Tia, you're not going to find these people. And I just kept pushing him. And one day I woke up in the middle of the night and wrote him an email at 4 a.m. and said, I'm not going to find these people, so I need to be able to do something else, especially as a qualitative researcher. So this was something that's been on my mind for a long time. And there's a number of different things that come into play here. Systemic racism, individual or personal racism, the rate at which we see churches closing in our dioceses that serve large Black Catholic populations. Black Catholics bear a disproportional burden of that when dioceses decide that churches need to close and parishes need to reorganize. So all of these things, for some folks, it could be all of that together. It could be one or two of those things that take precedent. But there are a number of different factors that contribute to that I've seen in my research, and I'll stop there and turn it over to you.
Yeah, it was interesting that when I saw that statistic, I was just shocked by it. Not surprised, but just shocked by the number. And so I went kind of digging through the rest of the report to find out what kind of narrative can we construct. And when we look at the key factors that Black people and Black Catholics identified as being important for looking for a church, they stress a welcoming congregation, inspiring sermons, but also the fact of avoidance a sense of discrimination and discomfort in the church. And when we look at how Black Catholics, according to this survey, 77% say that a commitment to anti-racism is essential to their faith, but only 13% of white adults will say that it's essential to their faith. I think we see a mismatch that's there in terms of, that Black Catholics this is something that's essential to who we are. That's not what we're finding in the Catholic Church. Elsewhere in the report, it said that 2/3 of Black congregates heard sermons about Black Lives Matter, whereas only 1/3 of white congregants heard anything about Black Lives Matter. So when you put those things together, we see a mismatch going on between the things that are essential for Black Catholics and how we understand our faith and the issues that are important to us. And it seems that it's less and less likely that those kind of concerns are going to be honored in a white congregation. And it's not that the whiteness of the congregation that's the problem, it's the unwillingness of the white community to engage those issues which are existentially important for African American believers and for Black Catholics. And so I think that, I think this is an extremely important finding that going forward pastorally, we have to pay attention to, because we see that where Black Catholics are leaving the Catholic Church at a far greater rate than even other Catholics, and certainly more than Black Protestants.
What does this mean for the Catholic Church? I think, Black Catholics as a whole are overlooked. And actually a quick question for Dr. Cox or Dr. Muhammad, were you surprised by the overall number? I mean, obviously Black Catholics are a small subset, but 6%, it's also a notable subset and one that has an interesting profile. Were you surprised at all by the numbers, or was it pretty much what you expected when you found those?
Honestly, I think I would have been surprised if I hadn't worked with Dr. Pratt before I got started. I think she helped us, she mentioned that she'd sort of been advising us as we got started. She helped us sort of refine an intuition for what we'd expect, so that when we went in, we could say, well, yeah, this makes sense. Rather than just like, well, I don't know, we'll see what the data says. We had a sense going in of what to expect from her qualitative work and advice.
And it's funny that it seems that, the Black Catholics within the church, and I've become aware of this so much over the past year, with so much emerging, and Shannon D. Williams and so many others, great Black Catholic scholars doing work and highlighting the history of Black Catholics. What a potent and powerful history it's been, in spite of institutional pushback, racism, and everything within the Catholic Church. So it's had it seems like an outsized role there. Father Brian and Dr. Pratt, what impact will it have on the church? I mean, has the Black Catholics just been their own orbit within the Catholic Church, or have they had an influence on the wider church that would significantly change if this exodus continues? If we don't have Black Catholics in the future, what does that mean for the Catholic Church in America?
Wow, that is a really big question. So let me take a stab at answering it. One is that if we don't have Black Catholics in the Catholic Church, then the Catholic Church is not what it says it is. It's not truly Catholic. It's not universal. And so I think this is I think when we look at the small numbers of Black Catholics, and the fact that of the Black Catholic exits from the church, this raises something about the integrity and the credibility of the Catholic Church. Mm-hmm. I wish I could be confident that the wider church even cared. And I'm just going to be very honest here, that for years, I think Black Catholics have realized that if we're going to have a presence in the church, it's going to be up to us to nurture that presence, because the wider church has, either through neglect or through active suppression, has not shown a real sense that they even care that there are Black Catholics in the church. And yet I think that, for its own credibility as being Catholic, it should be concerned about this. And if nothing else, given the magnitude of problems that Catholicism faces on any number of fronts, we can't afford to marginalize the gifts, the creativity, and the leadership of any part of our community. To put it bluntly, if we don't have Black Catholics in the church, there will not be another, Future Cardinal Wilton Gregory in the church. Mm-hmm. There will not be another future Sister Antona Ebo in the church, whose portrait is behind me. I mean, these are people who have had an outsized role and influence shaping the life of Catholicism. And if we don't nurture those gifts, then the entire church is poorer for it, but also the entire church isn't even what it purports to be.
Thank you. Dr. Pratt.
Yeah, I want to echo everything that Father Massengale said. And, I want to add to that, so yes, okay, so we're talking about 6% of the Black population is Catholic. But my entire professional life has been about asserting the fact that we're still talking about millions of people. Millions of people isn't nobody. Millions of people deserve and have earned a place in this discourse, and to not be taken for granted and to be a part of that. And like Father Massengale said, without Black Catholics in the church isn't what it purports to be. It's not Catholic. It's not universal. And so, I share Father Massengale's, lack of confidence that our church leaders really even care about this. But that's not a reason for Sister Antona Ebo or Father Massengale or Dr. Shannon D. Williams or Olga Segura, for any of us to give up on the work that we are doing, because it is too critical. It is too essential for the church as it continues to be able to to be what it says it is.
A couple of people noted that, you know, if Black Catholics are often too invisible within the Catholic Church, within the larger narrative of Black churches, they're often invisible in the Henry Louis Gates series, PBS series, very wonderful. A couple of people noted no mention of Black Catholics. No. Father Masson-Gales, how does that strike you?
That was something that I and many Black Catholics noticed when we watched that special, which was a wonderful special. But I noticed even something even more insidious, and that is that several times during the PBS special, there was a picture of a Black Christ with two outstretched arms. And they used that iconography over and over again. They never once said that this is from a Black Catholic church, from St. Sabina's in Chicago. And so they're using the iconography that Black Catholics have developed and trying to represent this as something as a gift to the wider Black church, but yet we don't merit any kind of inclusion in the actual story. So they kind of use our products. I mean, but they don't use, but we're not worthy to be part of the story. And so I think this is something that as Black Catholics we kind of face a kind of institutionalized neglect at best from our wider Catholic community, but also from our Black Christian sisters and brothers as well. We're not seen as being part of the family, even though by numbers, there are more Black Catholics than there are Black AME members, and certainly more Black Catholics than there are Black Episcopalians. But yet there were two major Episcopal leaders, Black Episcopal leaders, who were part of the Gates special, the PBS, yet we didn't see that kind of comparable representation in that narrative in the actual documentary.
Thank you. We're approaching the end. I want to go to kind of a last question, maybe for all of you. Why do Black Catholics stay? What, you know, again, with all of these challenges, both within the church and in society, secularizing trends that we see among all, what is it that keeps Black Catholics in the Catholic Church? Tia, do you want to start?
Yeah, I'll start with, you know, I get that question a lot, and I struggle with answering it because I feel like, in particular, it's a question white people ask of Black Catholics, which is its own thing. But in terms of Olga Segura has a new book, Birth of a Movement, Black Lives Matter in the Catholic Church. And I was very privileged to write the foreword to her book. And in that, I addressed that, and I invoked my late great uncle, Calvin Aguilard, who lived his whole life in New Orleans, which is our family's home. And he said to me once, you know, baby, this is my church. This is my church too, and I'm not going to let them mess it up. And my uncle was a well-known activist in the Catholic community, writ large Black Catholic community in New Orleans, as well as the specific Black Catholic community, which is quite large and strong in New Orleans anyway. And so, you know, I think about that often. I think about that conversation with him at his dining room table often. But, you know, this is my church too. And, you know, I'm not going to let him mess it up. I mean, really, if people who are doing this work, who think about these things, if we all go, then what's left? What's left in this church? And so, you know, we've got to keep pushing. We've got to keep fighting the fight and doing the work.
If I can expand on that, I mean, I would say, if I were in church, I would say amen. But I would think that for Black Catholics, this is a place where we have experienced the sacred in God. We find God in the sacred through the rites, through the rituals, through the sacraments. This is our spiritual home. And so this is the reason why we don't leave. But I think as Dr. Pratt was pointing out, there's also a sense of mission in Black Catholics that we believe, and I'm going to say this strongly, we believe in some level that the church needs us sometimes more than we need the church.
Yeah.
And I think that, this is the reason why we stay, that we have an essential contribution to make to the church, to make the church to be universal in fact and not just in rhetoric. And so I think that when you talk to Black Catholics, there's a sense of this is our home, this is where we've encountered the sacred, these rites and sacraments are meaningful to us. We're not going to let someone take that away from us. And more importantly, I think there's a sense of mission, that this is where God wants us to be. I can speak for myself that there are times when I've thought, you know what, I've had enough. I have uncles who are Baptist ministers who are always saying, come on over, Brian. I mean, you have your own mega church if you wanted. And I would say, no, that even when I want to go, God has called me here. There is work for me to do here. And I think that I'm not saying that because it's Brian Massing. I'm saying that this is something that Black Catholics share. We talk among ourselves. God has called us here, and we have a mission to and within this church.
Yeah, I just briefly would like to echo that, and I have had my own moments where I think I have one foot out the door and maybe the other foot is about to follow. But there is that mission that the church needs me, the church needs us as Black Catholics, just as Father Massengill said.
Well, I'm glad you're both staying, and I hope this event informs all of us, as it has enlightened and inspires all of us. I know it does for me. And again, facts matter, as Dr. Muhammad said, and all of this, we've been talking about this for so long, but this kind of research can inform actual pastoral practices, I think, across the board. Hopefully we'll do a follow-up. Dr. Muhammad, Dr. Cox, I think there's much more to be mined here, I think, and I look forward maybe to working again in the future with our friends and colleagues at Pew on this survey. So much here, so valuable. Thank you, Dr. Kiana Cox. Thank you, Dr. Bashir Muhammad. Thank you, Father Brian Massengale, Tia Noel Pratt. It's really been a terrific conversation. Thanks to all of our online audience, more than 200 of you. Terrific questions. Couldn't get to all of them, got to a lot of them, but we'll save those for next time. Thank you again, and I'm David Gibson at the Center on Religion and Culture at Fordham University. We will see you again in this space.